King Charles II's illegitimate children. Charles II, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland from 1660 to 1685, is one of the most notorious lotharios in history. He loved the ladies and took both noble women and commoner actresses to bed, often multiple times a day. And the ladies were certainly up for it. In addition to enjoying the charming sovereign's company, they also enjoyed the gifts, estates, and noble titles he lavished upon them and their children. Last week, we met Charles's 14 known mistresses. Today, we'll meet the results of all that sensual behavior, his 13 recognized illegitimate children. The king was far from a deadbeat dad. To his sons, he granted dukedoms and earldoms, and for his daughters, he arranged marriages to the wealthiest noble bachelors. The king personally populated a new generation of English peers. But despite his lusty libido, Charles didn't have a single legitimate child to inherit the throne. When he died and his unpopular brother became King James II, many in the nation looked to his eldest illegitimate son as a possible alternative monarch, and rebellion ensued. Let's meet King Charles II's 13 illegitimate children. Charles began his first love affairs while he was still Prince of Wales. His father, King Charles I, had gotten into a squabble with Parliament over who could legally tax the people, and the result was the English Civil War. His Majesty's Cavaliers and the parliamentarian Roundheads fought bloody battles for 9 years. To keep his wife and children safe, the king sent them to live at the court of his wife's cousin, King Louis XIV of France. Teenage Prince Charles traveled back and forth between Versailles and the court of his new brother-in-law, William II, Prince of Orange, in the Netherlands, trying to drum up support for his father's war. While the 18-year-old prince was in Rotterdam, he sired the first of his many children, James Scott. He was born to 18-year-old Welsh noble lady Lucy Walter. He was placed in the care of a wet nurse while his mother pursued his father around Europe. By the time James was 8, his parents had broken up, and the prince wanted custody. He had his son kidnapped and placed in the care of Baron William Crofts. James used the surname Crofts from then on. His mother died shortly after of venereal disease. Back in England, King Charles I lost the Civil War and his head. Prince Charles was now considered King Charles II in exile. But in reality, parliamentarian General Oliver Cromwell had taken over England. He claimed the title Lord Protector, but he ruled very much like a king. He was a Puritan and cracked down on the nation's morality, closing theaters and brothels, ordering everyone to remain sober, and even canceling Christmas. Cromwell died in 1658, and his son was ineffectual. By 1660, the English decided to end the Republican experiment, and they invited the prodigal prince back to reform the monarchy as King Charles II. The new king brought his 13-year-old eldest son with him, created him Duke of Monmouth, and appointed him a Knight of the Garter. Days after his 14th birthday, he was married to wealthiest Scottish heiress Anne Scott, who was only 12, and the Countess of Buccleuch in her own right. The king elevated them both to Duke and Duchess of Buccleuch. James took his wife's family name of Scott. At 16, he served under his uncle, James, Duke of York, in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. He proved to be a talented soldier and rose through the ranks with only a slight nudge from nepotism. He led several successful campaigns and gained a reputation as one of Britain's finest soldiers. The king commanded that all military orders be brought first to his son, making him effective commander of the military. James acquired Moor Park Mansion and became Chancellor of Cambridge University. He had 6 children with his wife and at least 3 others with mistresses. Meanwhile, Charles's wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, had 3 miscarriages. It seemed likely that she would never give the king a legitimate heir, and the people began to worry about the ascension of the next in line to the throne, Charles's younger brother, James, Duke of York. He had publicly converted to Catholicism, and the Protestant people were not interested. Many looked to James, Duke of Monmouth, as a possible alternative monarch. He had a lot going for him. He was Protestant, a celebrated war hero, and had a house full of sons to inherit the throne after him, while his uncle only had 2 daughters. Monmouth's popularity with the common people ruffled so many royal feathers that he was forced to go into exile in the Netherlands. He got tangled up in the Rye House plot, which aimed to assassinate his father. Monmouth claimed that his mother had been secretly married to the king, thus making him a legitimate heir, and said he had proof of the nuptials, though he never produced it. Meanwhile, the Duke of York spread rumors that Monmouth wasn't even the king's son at all, but the product of his mother's affair with the son of the Earl of Leicester. When King Charles died in 1685, his brother did inherit the throne and was deeply unpopular. Monmouth declared himself the rightful king, sailed 3 ships to England, and raised an army to march against his uncle. He met the royal forces at the Battle of Sedgemoor. Monmouth's ragtag rebels were no match for the regular army. His men who were not killed in battle were hanged or deported to the Caribbean. Monmouth escaped the battle and went on the run, but a reward for £5,000 was put on his head. The king's men tracked him down 2 days later, hiding in a ditch covered in brambles. King James granted an audience to his nephew, who begged for his life and even offered to convert to Catholicism. But the king informed him coldly that he must prepare to die. 36-year-old James, Duke of Monmouth, was taken from the Tower of London to Tower Hill. He refused to admit that his rebellion had been sinful. The axeman badly botched his beheading. He missed and struck the Duke in the back and head 5 to 8 times. James even rose from the block and staggered about before the horrified crowd. The axeman had to use a knife to cut the final sinew and detach the head from the twitching body. According to legend, it was realized that no portraits had been painted of the Duke, so his head was stitched back on his corpse. He was dressed in fine robes, and his visage was immortalized. James was buried in the Church of St. Peter ad Vicula in the Tower of London, near the remains of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and other victims of the Tower. During renovations in 2012, his bones were exhumed and his DNA tested, proving once and for all that he was the son of King Charles II. Many of his 9 children married other prominent nobles and became fixtures of the British peerage. One of his descendants, Lady Alice Scott, married King George V's son, Prince Henry, with whom she had Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Queen Elizabeth II's first cousin. Charlotte Fitzroy was Charles's second recognized illegitimate child. She was named Charlotte, the feminine version of Charles, and given the surname Fitzroy, Fitz meaning child of, Roy meaning king. This name has been used by illegitimate royal children since the Anglo-Saxon era. Charlotte was born in France while Charles was in exile. She was raised in England and Ireland by her mother and stepfather, Viscount Shannon. She married a playwright and had a daughter, Stuarta. After her first husband's death, her father arranged her marriage to William Paston, later the Earl of Yarmouth, with whom she had 4 more children. Charlotte died at 34 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, where her father would be laid to rest a year later. Charles Fitzcharles was the son of Catherine Peg and was born in France. He was sent to Spain to be educated and was known as Don Carlos. When he was 18, his father created him Earl of Plymouth. At 21, he wed Lady Bridget Osborne, daughter of the Duke of Leeds, Lord High Treasurer. They didn't have any children. In 1680, the Sultan of Morocco laid siege to Tangier. The port city had been given to King Charles by the Portuguese as part of his wife Catherine of Braganza's dowry. The younger Charles, now a colonel in the army, was sent at the head of a royal regiment to defeat the Sultan. Instead, he contracted dysentery in camp and died at the age of 23. The English were forced to surrender Tangier. Charles's body was taken back to London and laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. Catherine Fitzcharles was the second of Catherine Peg's children with the king. When the affair ended, her mother returned to England and married a baronet. Little is known about Catherine Fitzcharles, but she is believed to have become a Benedictine nun at Dunkirk Abbey in France. Her religious name was Sister Ophelia, and she lived to the impressive age of 101. Anne Palmer was the first of 5 children born to King Charles's greatest mistress, Barbara Villiers. According to legend, Anne was conceived on the night of Charles's coronation. This cannot be true, however, as she was already 2 months old on the day of the grand celebration, though she surely was conceived during the excitement of his restoration to the English throne after 11 years in exile. Both Barbara and King Charles claimed Anne was his, though many at the court noted how much she resembled another of Barbara's rumored lovers, the Earl of Chesterfield. At 13, Lady Anne was wed to Thomas Leonard, a gentleman of the king's bedchamber. On the same day, her 10-year-old sister, Charlotte, was betrothed to another of the king's favorites. Charles provided large dowries for both of his daughters and created Anne's groom Earl of Sussex and Charlotte's Earl of Lichfield. At 17, Anne had an affair with her father's mistress, Hortense Mancini. The 32-year-old Italian beauty enthralled the young Countess. The lovers had a fencing match in St. James Park, wearing only their nightgowns, and were ogled by the public. After the incident, Anne's husband sent her to a convent in Paris, where she pined for Hortense, lying in bed all day and kissing a miniature of her beloved. Anne was sprung from the convent and seduced by her mother's lover, Ralph Montague. She was eventually returned to her husband and bore him 4 children. Anne and her husband never got along. He was an extravagant man and gambled away his fortune and estate. The couple separated when she was 27. Anne was widowed at 54 and died at 60. Charles Fitzroy was Barbara Palmer's second child and the king's 3rd son. At birth, he was granted his legal father, the Earl of Castlemaine's subsidiary title, Lord Limerick. Barbara was a Catholic, and she had her son christened in the faith, but 6 days later, the king had him rechristened in the Church of England. At the age of 8, Charles was betrothed to Mary Wood, the only child and sole heiress of a wealthy baronet, but with the proviso that the marriage be delayed until Mary was 16. However, when her father died and she inherited his fortune, Barbara Palmer abducted Mary and raised her with her own children. At 13, Charles was created Duke of Southampton. At 15, he wed Mary Wood, but within months she died of smallpox, leaving her fortune to Charles. He waited another 17 years to marry again. At 32, he wed Anne Pulteney, and they had 6 children. When his mother died in 1709, Charles, as her eldest son, inherited her dukedom of Cleveland. He died at 68 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Henry Fitzroy was Barbara's third. At 9, he was married to 5-year-old heiress Isabella Bennet, Countess of Arlington. At the ceremony, diarist John Evelyn described Henry as exceedingly handsome, by far surpassing any of the king's other natural issue. He was created Earl of Euston. 3 years later, his father added the higher title Duke of Grafton. At 17, he was appointed a Knight of the Garter, and at 18, Colonel of the Grenadier Guards. He fought in the siege of Luxembourg. Henry got into an argument with a fellow officer and killed the man in a duel. This doesn't seem to have hurt his career, as he was soon appointed Vice Admiral of the Narrow Seas. After his father's death, Henry attended his uncle James's coronation and was named Lord High Constable. When James, Duke of Monmouth, rebelled against King James, Henry commanded royal troops against his half-brother. The Protestant English despised James, who had converted to Catholicism. But as his only surviving legitimate children, Mary and Anne, were both Protestant, the people just had to wait until James died. All that changed in 1688, when his second wife gave birth to a living son, James Francis Edward, who would supersede his sisters in the line of succession and become another Catholic king. Parliament wrote secretly to the king's eldest daughter, Princess Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, offering them the throne. Henry Fitzroy saw which way the wind was blowing. He abandoned his uncle and supported his cousins in taking over the country. King James fled to France, and William and Mary ruled as England's only joint monarchs. It was called the Glorious Revolution because royal power changed hands without bloodshed. But before long, James came back to reclaim his stolen crown. He rallied Catholic troops in Ireland, and Henry Fitzroy joined King William III's army against him. Henry was wounded at the storming of Cork and died at the age of 27. Some of his internal organs were removed and buried in Ireland, so his corpse could be preserved for transport back to England. Land that Henry, Duke of Grafton, had owned in the countryside outside of Dublin was later incorporated into the city. A country lane called Grafton Street thus became one of the main thoroughfares of the booming Irish metropolis. Henry is an ancestor of the prominent Spencer family, including World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Lady Diana Spencer. Her son, Prince William, is expected to become a king someday, and when he does, he will be the first direct descendant of King Charles II to sit on the throne. Charlotte Fitzroy. When she was 2, her mother Barbara bragged that her beauty would bring her excellent marriage prospects. Charlotte was painted by court artist Sir Peter Lely, along with her Indian page. She was described as rivaling her mother in beauty, but far unlike her in every other respect. Unlike hot-tempered Barbara, Charlotte was a sweet child and was favored at court. At 13, she wed Sir Edward Lee. The king created him Earl of Lichfield and granted a dowry of £18,000, plus a pension of £2,000 a year. In today's money, that's about $2.9 million up front and £320,000 a year. Marriage between young children was common in those days. The wealthy were keen to secure good matches for their children as soon as possible. But the couple did not have a sexual relationship until both were in their late teens. Charlotte was 18 when she became pregnant for the first time. Her father wrote to her, I must tell you I am glad to hear you are with child, and I hope to see you here before it be too long, that I may have the satisfaction myself of telling you how much I love you, and how truly I am your kind father. Charles Rex. Charlotte went on to have 18 children and inject a good bit of her father's DNA into the British upper class. She died at 53. A building was constructed right next to her house that would eventually be known as 10 Downing Street, the home of the British Prime Minister to this day. George Fitzroy, Barbara's last child by the king, was named Earl of Northumberland at 9 and then elevated to Duke of Northumberland at 18. He was described as a most worthy man, tall and black like his father the king. At 17, he was sent on a secret mission to Venice, Italy. Upon his return, he was installed as a Knight of the Garter. He commanded troops at the siege of Luxembourg. He was appointed a Lord of His Majesty's bedchamber. At 23, he wed Catherine Wheatley, the daughter of a chicken farmer, but the marriage was not happy, and George tried to lock his wife up in a convent. He lived at Frogmore House at Windsor Castle, which continues to be used by the British royal family today. Years after his father's death, he served King William III and was appointed Constable of Windsor Castle and Lord Lieutenant of Surrey and of Berkshire. Under Queen Anne, he became a lieutenant general in the army and a member of the Queen's Privy Council. He was widowed at 59 and married Mary Dutton. George died a year later at the age of 50. He had no children. Charles Beauclerk was the first child born to actress Nell Gwynn. There are two legends about how Nell secured a peerage for her son. The first is that when the king came to visit Nell, she said, "Come here, you little bastard, and say hello to your father." When the king protested, she replied, "Your Majesty has given me no other name by which to call him." The other is that Nell held her son out a window and threatened to drop him unless he was granted a peerage. The king cried out, "God save the Earl of Burford." When Charles was 14, he was granted an even grander title, Duke of St. Albans, plus an allowance of £1,000 a year, about £160,000 today. He was appointed Chief Ranger of Enfield Chase and Master of Hawk. At 17, Charles became a colonel in the army. He fought under Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I at the Siege of Belgrade. His mother died when he was 17, and he inherited her estate, including Burford House near Windsor Castle. At 24, he married Lady Diana de Vere, a famous beauty and daughter and sole heiress of the Earl of Oxford. They had 12 children together. Charles fought for William III at the Battle of Leyden and was appointed a Gentleman of the Bedchamber and Knight of the Garter. His liberal Whig sentiments held him back during the rule of conservative Queen Anne, but he was restored to favor under King George I. His wife Diana was appointed a Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife to George II. Charles died in the spa town of Bath 2 days after his 56th birthday and was buried in Westminster Abbey. James was Nell Gwyn's second son. When his older brother was created Earl of Burford, James was granted the subsidiary title Lord Beauclerk, from which both boys derived their surname. James was sent to Paris to attend school. He died there at the age of 6 of an unknown illness. Charles Lennox was the youngest of the king's 8 sons and the only child born to his second maitresse en titre, or official mistress, Louise de Carouaille. The year he was born, the king's cousin, Charles Stuart, died without an heir. His noble titles had been in the Stuart family for generations, and Charles was pleased to have another son to pass them on to. Baby Charles was granted the English titles Duke of Richmond, Earl of March, and Baron Setrington. and the Scottish titles Duke of Lennox, Earl of Darnley, and Baron of Torbolton. At 9, he was appointed a Knight of the Garter. At 20, he wed Anne Brudnell, granddaughter of the Earl of Cardigan. They had 3 children together. At 21, Charles joined what was at the time a little-known fraternal organization called the Freemasons. A few decades later, the secret society would explode in membership and count numerous royals and prominent people among its brethren. Charles was one of the earliest recorded Freemasons. He was also on the forefront of another trend, cricket. The English sport, which is now popular worldwide, was invented only a few decades before his time. He sponsored the Sussex side in the first known Great Match, putting up 500 guineas in prize money, about £84,000 today. Charles had an illegitimate daughter named Renee by his mistress. Renee later became a mistress to her own half-uncle, Charles Beauclerk. Charles, Duke of Richmond and Lennox, died at the age of 50. Both Richmond County, New York, aka Staten Island, and Richmond County, Virginia, in the United States, were named in his honor. Like his half-brother, Henry Fitzroy, Charles is an ancestor of the Spencer family, and thus Prince William. He is also an ancestor of Camilla, the Queen Consort, Prince Andrew's ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, and Game of Thrones actor Kit Harington. Mary Tudor was Charles's 13th and last recognized illegitimate child, and the daughter of actress Moll Davis. She grew up in a house near St. James Park and was surrounded by London's high society, artists, and thespians. No surprise, then, that she followed her mother's footsteps and took to the stage. She often entertained her father as part of the many elaborate theatrical performances at court. At 9, she played Cupid in support of her mother's starring role as Venus in Venus and Adonis. The king signed a royal warrant granting Mary the surname Tudor in recognition of his own descent from Henry VIII's sister, Margaret Tudor. She also received the precedence of the daughter of a duke, so she was addressed as Lady, plus an annual allowance of £1,500, about £240,000 today. At 21, she wed Edward Radcliffe, Earl of Derwentwater, and they had 4 children. The marriage was unhappy, and Mary, much like her father, was often unfaithful. During the reign of James II, Edward converted to Catholicism. He wanted Mary to do the same, but that was the final straw, and the couple separated. Edward died suddenly, and a week later, Mary wed Henry Graham, a member of Parliament. There were salacious rumors that the pair had been living together before Mary's first husband had died. Henry lost his position over the scandal, and died himself 2 years later. Mary then wed Major James Rooke. She lived to the age of 53. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.